We were just saying how strategic infrastructure, strategic road network.
He's on his way.
So that's the difference.
James, do you want to... Good evening, councillors, officers, those that may be joining us via the webcast this evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's meeting of Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation here at Maidstone, 13th of March 2018. We have a fairly small agenda this evening, so I'm not anticipating that this meeting will be any longer than it needs to be. In order to get us underway, I'll just do the usual housekeeping things. I'd like to advise you there's no planned fire alarm. If it does sound, it's the real thing, and we'll follow the instructions of Mr Tunnicliffe. And I would also like to say that tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, but if any others amongst us would like to record, would you please indicate? Not such that I would prevent you, but just so that we're all aware. Nobody's indicating. Right, so let's crack on. Apologies for absence. We have just received a note from Councillor de Wigandon that he is due to come through the front door any moment, slightly delayed by the train. Other than that, we're a full house this evening. Therefore, agenda item 2, there are no substitute members. And that takes us nicely into item 3, urgent items. And I just want to make sure that everybody is aware and has received the updated version of agenda item 16. Hard copies on your desks, has been emailed to us. Can I note that we've all had a chance to examine that in its corrected format? Yes? Excellent. Notification of visiting members. I see that we have Councillor Perry at the back. Are there any items you would like to speak to? Just observing. Thank you, Councillor Perry. Can welcome Councillor Wigandon. He's joined us for the record, and opportunely so because at this moment we can take agenda item 5, disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures, please? None indicated, therefore none noted. Similarly, item 6, disclosures of lobbying. No indications, therefore no lobbying to be noted. Item 7, we have no yellow papers in front of us, so I believe we'll be able to conduct the whole meeting in open session, members. Item 8, there are no petitions this evening, which moves us nicely into item 9, which is the minutes of the meeting held 6th of February of this year. Circulated with the papers. I trust you've all had a chance to consider them. Councillor Mrs Prendergast.
It's just a quick one, Chairman. Minute 158. What I actually said was that we must be careful not to segregate members of the Gypsy Roma traveller community into isolated rural locations. If the consequence of that is a better spread across the borough, then so be it. But those were the exact words that I used, and I think they mean something a little bit different. Thank you.
I think that has been checked on the webcast and is indeed correct. So, members, are you happy that we make that amendment accordingly? Are there any other corrections? That being the case, is it agreed that I sign them? Oh, Councillor Willis.
When we were talking about air quality stations that concerned us all, did we not set a date to report back or a date to get this thing in place, the full particulate monitor? There's no mention of a date on what's resolved, and I can't remember. Can anyone remember? I thought there was a date. We discussed the date.
I do not personally have a recollection of a specific date. I know that officers are endeavouring to do so as quickly as they can. But I don't believe that there was a date set, so I don't think there's a correction to make to the minutes. So apart from that amendment of Mrs Prendergast, can I sign those as an accurate record? Is that agreed? Thank you. 10, there's questions and answers from members of the public. None of those this evening. Can I ask you just to turn to the committee work programme? That's for information only. Is that noted, members? Oh, Mr. Egerton.
Just one point for the committee's attention. We will be bringing an additional item to this committee at the April meeting, which will be around the government's proposals for the consultation on the draft National Planning Policy Framework revisions. That will also include the consultation which is being undertaken by the government at the same time around supporting housing delivery through planning through developer contributions. So both of those matters will be brought to the next committee. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that would be very useful to us. Councillor English.
I'm not sure whether to raise this now or under the SIL report, but under section 206 of the revised report, it refers very briefly to, and I mean briefly, to what's done with the neighbourhood portion of SIL, where there is no parish council or neighbourhood forum. And I have to say, I think it really does skate over this, and this is actually a very key issue. And I really do think that details for this will be included in the future governance report is probably not sufficient. I really do think there needs to be a full report on this to the committee well in advance of the...
Can I suggest that when we get to the SIL item, maybe that we make a formal request or recommendation at that juncture? Let's deal with it in that manner. Councillor Willis.
At last full council, we agreed, I can't remember exact words, I think you ended up tailoring most of them, about and adding to the work programme, I believe. We said work rather than watch in brief about rail services. Can we add that wording to the work programme? The date doesn't need, it can be TBC because it's ongoing, isn't it? We've got till all, I think the announcement will be made in August, so we've got 4 or 5 months to have it as an item if we need to.
I completely take the point that you're making. I'll give you the official answer, which was the one that was being thrust upon me by our Chief Executive on the night. You didn't need to say it because it's actually in our constitutional mandate to do so on a continual basis. So it's additional print cost and nothing more than that.
Can you just explain that again? Sorry.
That we didn't actually really need to say at full council that we want strategic planning to continue to keep an eye on train developments and all the rest of it, because it's already inherently within the constitutional direction that we work under. Yeah, yes, to use another set of words. So, I take your point, but I don't think we need to actually note it separately. We will always keep an eye on any
Can I ask a question
changes.
On the same of you then? So if, say, for example, something comes up in April where we get some feedback from, say, a ministerial visit, a ministerial meeting that was perhaps to do with Thameslink, because that's not a confidential issue as such, and we get some feedback which is which may need local debate or perhaps some economic information or something that helps us, how can we get that to this committee? What's the process for doing that?
Well, as you're aware, when the Chair and Vice Chair set the agenda for each meeting, so anything that we become aware of that we consider necessary to be an agenda item, we would include. You can then back that up with an opportunity to ask a question at the meeting if you feel that something's missing from an agenda. So there's 2 routes in. Hopefully we'll pick up all the important stuff, but if there's something else, you can get a question. That being the case, are we satisfied with the work programme we're just noting? With that addition. Thank you. Outside bodies, I don't have any updates from my end of things. Anybody else? No, that's good. We can move to 13 then, please. This is a reference from Planning Committee, set out on your papers. I'm hoping we could just simply acknowledge this. Our parking services manager has preempted this and will bring a response and an option for us to consider within the off-street parking places order variation, which is in the work programme for our next meeting. So I think we can acknowledge the reference and you can take the assurance that it will be covered then. I see a number of people wishing to speak. I'm going to start from my left and work clockwise. Councillor Mrs Springett.
Depending on how you say we're taking this forward, if we're not sort of actually agreeing a recommendation tonight, I can leave it. I was just a little concerned that on item 2, I had a comment or a question on item 2. But if you want to take the whole thing to when the parking services manager's here, that's fine.
Personally, I think we could deal with it at the next meeting because there'll be some additional information for us. And then if there is a more in-depth follow-up, we can always ask for a further report. Councillor Willis. Okay, Councillor English.
Just for clarification, it really is only item 2 that the reference is about. The item 1, it was on this page, is actually already effectively proceeding. So just a point of clarification there, really, that we're only talking about effectively item 2 being discussed under that report. I'm quite happy for it to wait for that discussion, but I just thought I needed to clarify that because item 1 was specifically related to those 2 planning applications and essentially is an intrinsic part of the mitigation. So just to clarify.
Thank you for that clarification. That is useful. That allows us to move to agenda item 14, key performance indicator update. And I'd like to ask Ms Collier to introduce the item for us.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. This is the performance update for quarter 3. The key performance indicators monitor progress of the strategic plan and the Council's priorities. Overall, this quarter performance has declined and there has been a decline over the course of the year, particularly for the processing of major and minor planning applications. But this quarter drop has also been seen for other applications, whilst it does remain above its target of 85%. I think officers have provided a fairly comprehensive commentary outlining the reasons for this and how this will be monitored for the rest of the year and into the next financial year, and that can be seen on page 15 of your report. The additional indicator is the number of affordable homes that has been completions. This has also not been met this quarter. However, I would say this isn't unexpected, particularly for this time of year, and there is an expectation that things will continue to pick up and that the target will not only be met but exceeded by the end of the year. And I'm happy to take any questions.
I think if we take the questions and then perhaps officers will contribute some answers. I'll start again from my left, Councillor Wiggenden.
I think it's very. I wanted to ask 2 questions. Number one, it was that the majority of these homes, the affordable homes, come forward in the last 2 quarters of the year, and it says that's usual, and I wanted to know why that was. And secondly, it's good that we're getting these 43 affordable homes, but we had spoken somewhat in the past that there was still a trouble getting social rented properties built, and I just wanted to comment about that.
Who would like to?
I'll take the first point and
Mr. Jarman the second, yeah.
I believe from officers, this is reoccurring. We've seen this year after year, and it's to do with the developers pushing to complete everything towards the end of the year, so they kind of do it in a rush. it does slow down a bit around the winter period, but then, as it can already be seen, they start to pick up partway through and then push towards the end. We see it every single year.
Yeah, I can concur with what Anna said. With regard to your second point, Councillor de Wigan-Dean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I've had negotiations with developers 5 days a week, and it's not the 40% affordable housing in the countryside which is the viability issue for them as they present it to me. It's the 70% affordable rent versus 30% shared equity. It's quite a complex issue. One of their arguments is that 70% is just too high because, to be blunt about it, on the affordable rent, they don't make any money. But what's emerging as perhaps a bigger problem is that, I'm sure you know this, as do other councillors, the model of funding changed massively over recent years, when basically the government is pushing them to be like private businesses. So I often get letters from MDs of housing associations where they themselves say they don't want to take over this amount of affordable rent because it doesn't work with their business model. Shared equity does, but I could go on as well. There is an argument I've heard from some councillors as well in the rural areas that perhaps, because we look at housing need across the entire borough, we don't break down the need per parish, for instance. And I've heard some councillors arguing that actually 70% affordable rent within 40% affordable housing for, I'm not going to name the villages, is just too much for that village. When the actual need for affordable rent, as opposed to shared equity, is centred in the town of Maidstone. So maybe it would be a better idea to take commuted payments to provide for, yes, some in, dare I say it, the villages, but some on brownfield sites in the town.
Thank you for that answer. Councillor Mrs. Springett.
Thank you. I mean, Councillor de Wigan-Dean sort of asked the question. I was going to say, why are the affordable homes coming through at the end of the year? Is that because they're building them last on each development, or they're building the whole development towards the end of the year? It just seems crazy when we've got people shouting out for housing and we've got the government saying we must provide more housing quickly, that the affordable bit is being almost kicked into the long grass. I'm just wondering how we can try and stop that happening.
In my experience, it wasn't so long ago where the affordable units were the first to be built. You know, perhaps I'm going into too much detail. Often, you know, obviously there's a deal to be made between the house builder and the housing association, but I can think of some contracts whereby the practical reason why the affordable goes in first is because the housing association agrees not to just take over, I don't know, 30 affordable units, but they provide the access road as well. So it's actually, you know, going in the direction of the house builder. And like Anna alluded to earlier, I think the house building sector is a very sort of traditional sector. They have a winter break. And I think for just, you know, accountancy reasons, they tried to get things finished by the end of the financial year.
The other thing I'd say is this is only calculating that. So we've been very explicit in the name of the indicator, but we're not in this calculation, we are only looking at affordable units. So we're not looking at other units.
Councillor English, I think you're next.
The specific question I was going to ask has already been dealt with. Just to observe that the long-term projections, medium-term projections, are actually much more encouraging than what one might conclude from the snapshot here. We had a discussion at the planning group spokespersons meeting about that with Mr Bailey, and there are specific reasons for some of the slightly disappointing figures here, but it is anticipated that it will continue to improve over the next few months.
I don't want to be the absolute pessimist here, but I think we've got to hope that what you've just reported back is the case. But the bottom line is these indicators are not where we wanted them to be. And my concern underneath this is that, so we're focused on a very few indicators here. I think the committee might remember that we deliberately cut the KPI list down to the bare minimum so that we weren't unnecessarily collecting data. And these are just the statutory indicators. But we reserved the right to bring in additional indicators if there was an area of concern. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that we want to do that right now, but I am concerned that certain things are being prioritised, and we're seeing the reporting on those. Even then, we're not really getting to where we want to be, but it may be at the expense of other areas, perhaps enforcement as an example. So I just want to record a note of concern and say that we really need to look at this very, very carefully moving forwards.
Just to come back on that, I wasn't going to say this, but as you have specifically mentioned other areas, including enforcement, I think it's fair to say that members of this committee and the planning committee and officers are quite aware of some of the issues, and especially around enforcement, and you can expect an agenda item in not too distant future looking at the reporting and prioritisation of enforcement issues in particular, because that was something that was agreed, or well, as a proposal to come forward to this committee at the meeting I just mentioned.
Very good. So we'll keep a very close eye on this, and my personal thinking is that if there isn't something substantially better next time around, we do need to drill deeper with some fresh cuts of the KPIs. But on that basis, is it agreed that we note this report? Noted? Excellent, thank you. We can move on. Agenda item 15. This relates to 20 mile per hour speed limits and zones. And Ms Houghton is going to start us off.
Thank you, Chairman. This report sets out the work that has been carried out to date on the introduction of 20 mile an hour schemes in Maidstone Borough. The matter has previously been discussed at full council in December 2015, where it was resolved that this committee review all the available evidence and consider the implementation of 20 mile an hour speed limits within the borough. At the meeting of this committee in March 2016, it was resolved that in the local plan period, pilot studies be undertaken of certain sections of highway in Maidstone where there is acknowledged pedestrian and vehicle conflict and where there is resident support in order to deliver 20 mile an hour speed limit areas. An update was provided to this committee in April 2017 of the exploratory work that has been undertaken into identifying a budget to commission a study, an engagement with Kent Police and Kent County Council Highways. Officers have sought advice from KCC Highways and explored the possible costings of implementing 20 mile an hour schemes in the borough. The capital costs of implementing 20 mile an hour schemes are made up of the installation of signs, posts and any required traffic calming measures. There are also associated revenue costs. The development of 20 mile an hour schemes have been primarily funded through the county's casualty reduction strategy or the combined member grant. Currently, no funding for the feasibility study has been identified. Since the matter of implementing 20-mile-an-hour schemes was last discussed at this committee, the KCC 20-mile-an-hour policy has not been changed.
Thank you for the introduction. I think Councillor English would like to go first.
I could say a lot of things about the process and how we got to it and how I'm not particularly pleased about certain things. And that is not in any way a criticism, by the way, of either of your two officers here this evening, who I think have done a very good job. I don't want that put on the record. But what I do want to do is try and focus on a couple of things that I think will be relatively uncontroversial, and I think we could probably agree them now as something that we could take forward. And then the third point might be a little less straightforward, so I'll do the first two first. I'd like to substitute the recommendation that this report be noted with a slightly more positive recommendation, which I think we can agree. Point one being that as part of the review of the local plan process, we look at introducing a policy of 20-mile-an-hour zones on all new developments. That is recommended by government guidance that the default position should be, but unless there is reason to the contrary, 20-mile-an-hour zones should be in place on all new residential. Sorry, did I miss the word residential out? Sorry, if I did, I apologise. Residential developments. That would be point one. I wouldn't have thought that was particularly controversial, because if members did have a huge issue with that, it could be handled as part of that very same review process. So I'm not sort of mandating the outcome of that review. I'm just saying that as part of the review, we look into establishing that as the default policy position. Point two would be more immediately that where practical, this council looks at the possibility of introducing 20-mile-an-hour zones in urban regeneration. And where appropriate, they might include village regeneration schemes. It would not mandate us to do it, but would give us the opportunity where major planning policy documents like town centre improvement areas come forward, or our own council regeneration proposals or other regeneration proposals come forward, to actually look at whether a 20-mile-an-hour scheme should be included. Now, I'm not saying that we would then necessarily do it, but would give us the opportunity to do so. And if it hadn't been for the fact that it's too late, I might have suggested that for the Brunswick Street area, but what's done is done. So I wouldn't have thought those two things were necessarily terribly controversial, because they are just requesting policy and council to look at examining those two things. However, it does seem that they are controversial, so I will rest on the third point for the moment and just leave it on those 2 points.
I'm going to move anti-clockwise. Councillor Wilby.
I was just going to say that I support 5, and especially in point 1. A lot of estates or new housing estates that are built at the moment don't even, you can't go 30 miles an hour, so actually having a 20 mile speed limit is not going to have a huge impact. Also, a lot of estates now are just one road in, one road out, so you're talking about one sign at the start. So the cost implication is not a huge lot to the housing builder as such. Also, if you've got those that speed restriction in place at the beginning, we're not obviously having to put new traffic orders out and so on. So I'd just like to say I support that, and I would like to second his proposal for the amendment to it.
The way you say that you don't go over 20 mile an hour in these developments already almost suggests it's unnecessary, but I'm sure that wasn't what you were meaning.
No.
Councillor, do you want to come back?
I do want to come back to that. As I said, they're not designed to go at 20 mile an hour. It doesn't mean that people do not go at 20 mile an hour. Okay,
I think that was good to clarify that. Councillor Mumford.
I'll come on to what's being proposed in a minute. There are a lot of people, there are some people that would like to look at 20 mile an hour and are considering air quality and the balance there. So that has got to be considered. Recently, I've been in negotiation with KCC about putting 3 zones in my area. And we looked at the procedure, etc. And we're currently going through it. As far as the report is concerned, we are dealing with KCC, and the figure charged for the monitoring is £800, not 500, as the report states. That was my first bit. Now, the key to it is your mean speed. And also that these should be self-enforcing. So the problem we've got with that proposal is where I am at the moment. I'm doing the monitoring, and I can't decide whether it's going to be a limit or a zone, because I might have to put traffic calming in if it's above a mean speed of 24. And so it's got to be self-enforcing. For us to look at a new site before it's built and to be able to establish whether we need a zone or a limit would be very difficult, because we've got nothing to gauge it on, and we've got to make it self-enforcing. That to me seems a problem. I'd like to back it. I just think it's got a practical application problem.
Let me continue to go around that side, and then we'll try and wrap this up. Councillor Mrs Springett.
I just think that's a bit too blanket. I would support a wording that somehow says that consideration be given at the planning approval stage. It's too late. But no, I don't want it as a blanket over every development, because you don't know how big a development. Has it got a wide road going through the middle of it because it links between that main road and that? I think it's too blanket, what you're proposing.
Councillor de Wiggenden.
National roads residential.
I don't think it was necessarily controversial, although probably just an expression. And I think it actually probably is a good idea that going forward that there is a presumption that most residential developments are designed in such a way that they are only 20 miles an hour. It's simply the point that this was for us to note, and for us to, and for studies to be undertaken by officers, and yet we seem to be writing conclusions already. That was my first point. That was my main point. I'm perfectly happy with the idea that you were putting forward, and I think actually as a presumption that they should be designed like that, and developers should know that. That's not a bad idea at all.
So it seems to me that we're not necessarily against the principle of having a look at it in principle, but the detail of the debate which we're getting into should be something we'll do from an informed point of view. Councillor Mrs Prendergast.
Thank you. I presume we're talking here about speed limits within a development itself, and not the frontage of a... Okay, fine, because I was a little bit unclear on that, because that could have... but why, why don't we... I mean, really, this is a highways matter, and shouldn't we just be looking at recommendations to highways rather than getting involved in it ourselves? But, where you suggested the words "where practical," I think in point 1, you should use "where practical," because the other key matter is enforcement. How on earth do you enforce? Because I've been working on lots and lots of 20-mile-an-hour restrictions as a KCC member in rural lanes, and we always come down to, there's that 15th percentile who just won't stick to the rules, and they'll crash through at 60 miles an hour, and that's it.
I think the concept that I'd be interested in exploring, and that we could do it through the process, is if it was 20 by design, without having to actually even put a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit sign up, but the natural calming is within the design. That's where I'm... Mr. Exeter, did you want to contribute at this stage?
I would just add one point of clarity. I mean, the consideration of this within potentially the local plan review and so forth. I think as we move forward with the policy side, that's where Maidstone Borough Council does have the ability to potentially influence and can investigate. I think the concern is that if we are to look at short-term measures prior to the local plan review coming forward, that's where we get into the ground that's been mentioned by Councillor Prendergast. And the matter of fact is that as we stand now, officers have really done as much as they can, I think, without the sort of capacity increase to investigate this work. Really, it's a matter now for Kent County Council to take matters forward and for Kent County Council to be informed as to where members would like this to be considered for areas and then potential pilots. So that would be there's two, I think, separate matters that we're dealing with here. One where we move over to Kent County Council, and so we've done as much as we can really at our level. However, the second option would be to do with the local plan review. Whilst what officers can't do is say that there would be guarantees that we'd have a blanket consideration, a blanket need for 20-mile-an-hour zones across new development areas and in site allocations, we could investigate the possibility of that and the feasibility of that through a design-led approach for such allocations. Thank you.
Very good. Councillor Cox.
Thank you very much. I think the officers that have spoken, and I saw Rob Jarman nod his head, I think that's where we need to be leading this from. It's the officers that speak with the developers. You almost don't have to have a policy, because the way that when you speak to a developer, you would say, I'm sure you would agree that this is a family development and we have a play area, and therefore why wouldn't you want to have the design within the development to reduce speeds so that the people who live here are safe? That is all we're trying to say. A 20-mile-an-hour sign, Councillor Burton, is only a deterrent. We've been told that KCC and the police won't enforce. So what we're saying, it's personal enforcement. It's the people driving that if they see the flashing light that says you're going too fast, it doesn't zap them from the earth if they're going too fast. It doesn't take anything. See? I'm just saying that I think we should be encouraging developers to do this even before we look at the refresh on the plan. Because I think where we set out our table when we first talk, be it PPA, whatever stage, if we say we would like to live in a safe community, how can you help when you design your development? Would it be good and prudent to say that we could have the flow of traffic in such a way that it slows people down? So therefore, we don't have to ask the police to enforce. Why wouldn't the Kent County Council say, oh, I think that's ridiculous. Why should we ask the developers to pay for the signage? Why should we ask them to design it? It wouldn't be there. Because if our officers leading this and the design factor comes in, it will naturally happen. And people will not, a year after we put the 20-mile-an-hour sign near a school in North Ward, be going faster again. We can't re-put them in. It's the desire to slow down where you know where you are.
Councillor English.
I'm sorry, I usually agree with Martin, but that's actually completely wrong. You can't go to a developer, for the most part, unless there's a very established relationship, and Councillor Willis has just done this in her Hermitage Lane site, and just ask them nicely to do things. There has to be a policy base, because there are good developers and there are bad developers. And we've all had the experience of dealing with a well-known bad developer who's been in the media recently for the amount they pay their executives, who had to be threatened with court action just to meet their Section 106 obligations. So I'm not saying that we should mandate the outcome. What I am saying is that we should consider, during the review of the planning process, how a default position of 20-mile-an-hour should be looked at, but obviously, where there are particular reasons that a 20-mile-an-hour scheme should not be put in, that would not happen. But we can evolve policy to set out what the criteria are and how that's met. And with the proper design, yes, I think we would need the odd sign, but with a proper design, it is effectively self-enforcing, and that is what we want. So I think with new build, it is actually quite easy, and all I'm saying is that we should, as part of the review process, look at how we achieve this. And I think we can agree that part.
That's quite clear then. I want to wrap this up with a conclusion. You did indicate, Councillor Willis, is it?
I did have a second point, but can we take it one at a time, shall we?
Is it relevant before we tidy that up?
I don't think this is something that can be rushed, Chair. You're the Chair, but this is quite an important issue. It's an issue that we do have some jurisdiction over under the planning process, and I just think it needs time. We've got slightly different opinions on it, I think, not cross, even, you know, so I think we need to try and get to a rounded bit of thought and perhaps some action rather than pushing it into a long grass again, because this dates from 2015, but as much action as we can. That wasn't my original point, but that's, can I just ask of you, can we give this the time it needs?
I don't have any intention to do other than that. If it is helpful, can I try and state the words that I think you've delivered to us thus far, and then we'll tune that if we need to?
Can I finish what I was... Because I haven't spoken at all on it, and I wanted to ask a couple of questions that might help the words. No, sorry, yeah. So I've looked into 20 miles an hour in other areas, as some of us probably have. A couple of bits of information I have found out are that Faversham are looking at it and are spending, not spending money, but are ongoing. Mike Whiting, who is the KCC Cabinet Member for Transport, is in favour in Swale of 20 miles an hour zones. So they have some support from him. So there's a bit of good news, a bit of optimism, perhaps, if we find a sensible solution ongoing. The other thing is the reason why I think we do need 20 miles an hour signage as well as measures to slow traffic down on new developments, because I think that's the first subject, is because can I ask the officer a question, very simply? In your professional understanding, does 20 mile an hour zones, perhaps can ask this of one of the policy officers, do 20 mile an hour zones improve or help walking and cycling? Is there a link between the two?
Can I just, we're sort of adding to probably the part that we've already got consensus.
The reason why I'm asking is because it might add some wording to what we may or may not agree.
I'm not adding any wording.
Let me say what I think we're considering and try and keep it as succinct as possible, and then if we feel we need to add to it. So I think we've got a 1, 2, 3 potentially here. One is we note the report. 2 is that as part of the local plan review, 20 mile per hour limits or zones be considered for inclusion in criteria for residential development.
Be a little wider than that, but I'll accept that as a way forward.
Okay, right. So that would be the 2. The 3, and maybe you throw this out, is that officers be asked to introduce the concept of 20 mile per hour design in current discussions with developers. So that's just a sort of an advisory guidance. So that's the 1, 2, 3 as I see it.
That was on the first point I moved, yeah, and we can take that as a separate...
Your motion, but that's how I'm just trying to get it recorded. Can I let Mr. Jarman contribute?
Yeah, I agree with you, Chair, and Councillor Cox. To my mind, it's a fundamental of good layout, which is part of design, that you design housing layouts to reduce average speeds. What is being pushed in all design guidance that I see is sort of reintroducing the street, going back from sort of suburban streets where all the parking is off street, so the cars themselves act as traffic calming. I'd be very surprised if people are speeding when people are opening car doors. Just on a very but on a very practical level, I have had many a discussion with KCC Highways in the days when there was something called home zones. what KCC don't like, and for once I fully agree with them, is maintaining this signage, because as Shalina said, signage gets damaged. I don't particularly like traffic calming because of the impact on air quality, but if you start putting in, little gravel sets to create humps and things, those have to be maintained by the public purse.
Okay, so useful advice, but that's the detail that will come from future policy consideration.
I did mention a second point, but I'm happy to take a vote on what we've got at the moment and then come back to that.
Let's hear your second point before we go too far.
Well, following a discussion with officers, it did seem that there might be some mileage in looking at mileage. I'm sorry, I do apologise for the bad pun. In looking at how 20-mile-an-hour zones could be incorporated with into regeneration schemes that is being brought forward, where practical. And it did seem that officers thought that would be at least worth considering.
I think that's almost inherent in the process. Whenever we're considering a regeneration, why doesn't somebody suggest it for that regeneration?
Well,
we're stating the obvious
think it
about
might be stating the obvious, but it has slipped by in a couple of previous discussions where it could have come up, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone else for not bringing it up. So if you wouldn't mind awfully, because I don't think officers are saying that this would actually be a sort of particularly onerous responsibility to actually ensure that's part of the checklist.
Okay, we'll think of some words for that. I've thought of a fourth point actually as well, and that this applies to cyclists. 20 miles an hour. Right, Councillor Willis, I mean, not if it's preempting the future piece of work, but if it is directly relevant.
We've been going on about this. This goes back to 2015. It's not rocket science. Can we just ask the question, does 20 miles an hour zones and signage, does any of our officers have any example or know where it increases cycling, increases safety to some degree, but does it increase cycling or walking? Does it support our strategy? That's what I'm asking.
Mrs Arnold possibly could help us.
To be honest, it really depends on the site specific. There isn't a standardised response to say that for every 20-mile-an-hour zone you'll see an increase in cycling and walking. It will be site dependent on the geography, the appropriate mitigation and everything else, and the style in which you're bringing the zone in. Some of the traffic calming measures can actually discourage cycling because they cause a barrier to cyclists, but might increase pedestrian. It is entirely site specific.
So if we added a point 4 that said opportunities to consider 20-mile-an-hour schemes within regeneration opportunities, yes? Consider where practical, yes. Right, we're not committed to it, but of course we'd look at it in each case. So those 4 points, if you've all got those in your head, I think it's Councillor English's motion. I think Councillor Wilby had indicated he wanted to second. Those in favour? Unanimous and therefore carried. Thank you. Last and not least, agenda item 16. We're going to turn to Mrs Arnold to help us with consideration of matters relating to SIL.
Thank you, Chairman. This report updates members on the progress of administrative arrangements for the Community Infrastructure Levy. For the purposes of this report, administration relates to the process of collecting SIL receipts and the passing of SIL monies to parish councils and neighbourhood forums. It focuses on the key issues highlighted in November's committee report regarding the administrative and engagement arrangements, as well as covering in detail the proposed engagement with parish councils and approaches for administering the non-strategic portion of SIL. A future report will be brought to the committee regarding governance. Officers have produced a process map outlining the administrative stages and have commenced discussions with relevant internal teams to identify the best approaches as well as identifying symmetry with existing internal processes. It is proposed that officers arrange a workshop with both members and parish councils to cover in detail the legislative requirements of SIL, with particular focus on the non-strategic spend, otherwise known as the neighbourhood portion. This portion can be spent by parish councils or neighbourhood forums within whose area the development falls. The distribution of neighbourhood SIL money is 15% for areas without a made neighbourhood plan, capped at £100 per dwelling per annum, or 25% where there is a made neighbourhood plan in place, which was made before a relevant planning permission first permits development. The SIL regulations state that parish councils and neighbourhood forums must spend the SIL for their area on the provision, improvement, replacement, operation or maintenance of infrastructure, or anything else that is concerned with addressing the demands of the development places on an area. The intention is to prepare an agreement for parish councils identifying the responsibilities and liabilities for both parties. The agreement will identify, in line with legislation, how the money will be transferred, the timescale and process of acceptance, how it can be spent, the timescale in which it should be spent, the requirements for annual monitoring and reporting, dispute resolution, and also request evidence that there is appropriate financial and other procedures in place. To assist all parish councils and neighbourhood forums in making the best use of their receipts, they will be encouraged to identify the priorities for their area and produce and publish on their website a SIL infrastructure spend plan. This should have short, medium and long-term objectives and prioritise the projects identified in any neighbourhood plan.
Thank you. I'll start with Councillor Mrs Prendergast.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not a SIL expert, so I'm going to try and articulate this as best as I'm able to. And before we go into the discussions or the recommendations on this paper today, I just want to talk to you about my concerns about SIL. Lately, I've become quite involved in infrastructure projects to do with large housing developments. And at a meeting a little while ago, the officer present told me that a development of, say, 1,000 homes would generate something like £5 million. A development of 1,000 homes would also require a new primary school to fit it, and let's say I know the primary school would have to be a 2-form entry. The cost of a 2-form entry primary school, from my experience, is about £5 million. So how does SIL work? How are we paying for how are we then paying for the roads and the other? I'm really concerned that, I'd like some explanation, but my concern remains.
I'll start off with a response, and then Ms Arnold may come in. The equivalence there, I mean, is one which is quite interesting. We have the ability, if we wish to, as an authority, to bring in payment in kind. What this means is that there would be a contribution, potentially it would be on-site, where instead of payment of a community infrastructure levy, there would be a wider benefit piece of infrastructure, such as a school, that would be bought on-site and developed on-site. The difference here is that with Section 106 agreements, which require on-site mitigation to compensate for the development, the payment in kind mechanism would need to be triggered to allow for infrastructure on that site which would be of wider interest to the community, a wider benefit to the community. So that's the differentiation, really, and that differentiation continues across SIL and Section 106. So Section 106 will always be associated with a particular scheme, a particular site, and SIL will be infrastructure which is of benefit more widely or require more than one site to contribute towards it. So we would have to trigger that payment in kind mechanism to allow that school to come forward on that site if it was a more than single site benefit, if it was for a wider community benefit.
Does that answer your question?
We had a Section 106 briefing earlier on, and we were talking about the number of... I mean, this could be quite an interesting negotiation if you've got 10 developers involved, couldn't it?
My apologies. Indeed so. We're straying slightly into the realms of how we would govern our community infrastructure levy at this stage. But the point is that the community infrastructure levy does have that mechanism of payment in kind, if we were to want to trigger it, that would allow a development to take place, such as a school, such as a hospital, and so forth, other broader community infrastructure on the site in question, instead of, in lieu of, the SIL contribution.
I think Councillor Mrs Prendergast was talking about a briefing there, and perhaps those elements will come in with one of the proposals that we have in front of us, which it relates to a workshop. For my own part, I must admit, as we get closer and closer to the reality of SIL, my concerns about it do grow. And I know a couple of neighbouring authorities that are, choosing not to deploy this mechanism. Let's carry on. Councillor Wilby, you would be next.
Yeah, I think when we talked about this before, at this committee, I did raise some concern that we seem to be involving the parishes quite late at the end of this process, which we've been criticised before about doing. And basically, I did talk to the officer who actually done this report. I just had some concerns. It feels like we're kind of telling the parish where they're going to be spending their money. I know it's to be worked out in the workshop, as such the final detail of it, but it seems to be leaning towards that kind of way that we're going to be interfering with the parish since reading this report. As we've been criticised before for not engaging with local parishes, could I just ask why, say, obviously a lot of the parishes signed the CALC, why they've not been consulted, or have they been consulted? It's just not detailed in the report.
I really don't think that's fair to say that we're bringing them in at the last moment. This is the moment to bring them in, and the way SIL operates, it's a fairly clear-cut 1, 2, 3 list of what you can spend the money on. They're the rules that we don't make. So, I don't know if an officer can respond.
Picking up on your point, whilst we will start collecting SIL receipts from the 1st of October, as you go through the report, the earliest point that we would be making any payment to a parish council would be the 1st of April next year. So actually, whilst it may feel we're very close up to SIL receipts being implemented, we still have sufficient time to brief parishes, have the workshops, provide them with the clarification around what the legislation states and the restrictions it places on them before they would be receiving their first neighbourhood portion on the 1st of April. Oh, in fact, 28th of April, should I say.
Just one very quick point. I think I would like to just highlight the difference between consultation and engagement and briefing. We are not expected as an authority to consult parish councils or CALC or anyone else around the legislation which has been set nationally by the government, which is what is dictating the administrative procedures that are the subject of this report. So in other words, what we are offering as an authority to parishes is the ability to have a briefing to explain to them what the government system is and the administrative arrangements which result from that system. What we're not proposing to do is consult because we can't consult because it isn't optional. We are in a position, though, where we would like to provide them with a briefing so that they are more clear about the requirements which have been set out for them by the government. Thank you.
Anything to add?
No, I was just going to say that does answer my questions. I'm quite happy, actually happy with that. Okay. The only other one question that actually had to go with it was, again, it was alluded to us before. You say about the receipt payments going to the parish. I just want to clarify this completely, that they will be given their 15 or 25%, and they will hold it, not us. They won't draw off it as such.
In terms of the payment being transferred to them, the legislation requires them to have appropriate governance and spending procedures in place. Providing they satisfy all of the legislative requirements, then the 15 or the 25% would be transferred to them up to twice a year.
So who actually judges whether they're competent, as such, as you're saying?
Okay. I mean, if I draw upon my little bit of experience of chairing a parish council, there are, fairly strict rules relating to audits and, for example, taking this kind of sums of money will probably push their audit requirement up from the very, very basic to something a little bit more in depth. So it's those mechanisms that are in place already through legislation and protocol that I think will be relied on. And it's actually quite an exciting moment that, that you could see scenarios where parish councils on very large developments could be faced with possibly £500,000 or £250,000. And it would be very interesting to meet at the big table to say, do you know what, the medical centre deficit was our big concern. The parish council is saying, well, here's our contribution to that. It's the big picture stuff that they get to participate with. Councillor Willis.
I don't represent a parish area. I believe, many of us don't, I suppose, actually. I believe that we are getting some training on SIL, actual member training on SIL. That's the first question. Second question, will there be some training on neighbourhood plans offered again? I think it may have happened before, because that is relevant to the amount of SIL that's paid. And the third question is, it's just a passing comment that places that don't have parishes are losing out. This is not a Maidstone Borough Council issue, but the places that don't have parishes are, frankly, being discriminated against because it's harder to do a neighbourhood plan if you haven't got a structure in place.
I don't think they lose out because the money's still there. It's just that we're the body that utilise it. Let's just pick up on this point about training versus engagement, to be clear. No councillor. No councillor. We'll deal with Councillor Willis first.
So in regards to the earlier point about training, as outlined in the report, there is the proposal to do a engagement workshop, sort of essentially a briefing to both members and parish councils around the administration and the neighbourhood portion element. Obviously, as we bring forward governance, etc., there will be the intention to do similar workshops around governance and ensure that everyone is kept informed. But initially, in terms of the neighbourhood portion, it will be a member and parish council workshop.
We're lucky you came to the earlier workshop on Section 106 agreements. And, well, I saw you, didn't I? Our new major projects officer used to work up until recently in Sevenoaks, who are sort of like the Kent leaders in SIL. And what he was saying to me, whilst you guys were speaking, is it's not an awful lot different in terms of governance to Section 106s. In say through a Section 106, X amount of money is, I'll pick on our own Parks and Open Spaces section. It's not just a matter of £100,000 goes to Parks and Open Space and a certain play area is to be improved. What Parks and Open Spaces should do is say, here's our programme. This is going to happen in the next 12 months. Which items of that playground are going to be added to, etc., etc., a working programme. And when the parish council or KCC, are asking for their SIL money, we shouldn't just say, here you are. We should be saying, well, where's your project plan?
Do we have a date for training? Some of us are up for election, so who knows what will happen with elections and whether we get... It'd be good to try and have that knowledge under our belt, I think, wouldn't it?
Is there in mind a timetable for the council? 20th of June is provisionally thought about should we agree to such a way forwards this evening. Councillor English, and then we'll try and wrap up on this.
Okay, firstly on the point that Council will be raised about, and other people were discussing about who sets the framework for whether someone is compliant with, shall we say, financial standards. No problem for parish councils, generally speaking. We're all audited, although with the very smallest it's a light touch audit, but there's all audited. The problem I would imagine, and I'm sure it is a problem, and this isn't meant to be an aspersion on anyone, is when you get to bodies who may be not local government organisations like neighbourhood forums, or fora, which I still insist is the correct plural, and because they are clearly not subject to the same sort of regulation in general as local authorities, even parish councils, so that could be an issue. Secondly, as far as I'm aware, you're quite right, Ms Arnold, in terms there's very little room for consultation on what the SIL regulations do say, but there is, I know various local authorities have done consultations as opposed to briefings on governance arrangements because they can take different shapes and forms, so there's a distinction there. Which brings me to my real point. I mean, I'm quite perturbed that, unlike with all the previous reports on this, one group of people has suddenly dropped off completely, no mention of members of this council who do not represent parished areas. And in previous reports, there has been at least reference to the fact that some sort of mechanism needs to be developed where members of this council who are elected to represent their communities but do not have a parish council can be involved in this. I am not going to accept, on behalf of my constituents, the senior management team of this council or the leader of this council, whatever party, determining what spend should take place in my community without me even being consulted. It's outrageous and totally unacceptable by any definition. And 206 says the council will decide the non-strategic community spend in the non-parished areas. When we say that, that normally means the senior management team of this council and possibly the leader of the council or P&R. None of those options are acceptable. There's got to be, before any decision is made to implement this, a mechanism for members of this council, however it's done, to be involved in the discussion of SIL payments for our communities. Anything else is unacceptable. And I would therefore like, under recommendation B, local ward members in unparished areas to be included in the list of people mentioned there, because it is a massive lack of appearance there, and it has been in all previous drafts of this report that we would be involved in these discussions.
So if I just comment back, engage with all interested parties.
But it goes on to list a significant group of others and refers to parish councils and neighbourhood forums several times in his report.
Let me respond if I may. Okay. So I think it's quite clear that all interested. So there is a catch-all there. There's no harm in putting the specific in, but I don't think there's any intention within that resolution to bar or sidestep anyone.
Well, in that case, there shouldn't be a problem in inserting it then,
yes, but let's just be clear that, as it stands, they weren't excluded.
Well, I think that
Mrs Arnold, do you want to add to that?
I was just going to provide some clarification. By council, that was just an overarching term. No decision has been made in terms of that, which is why it would be included within a future governance report that would come forward expressing exactly how that particular portion would be spent. It is something that requires proper consideration, and therefore we felt that it should form part of the overall governance approach, and that is the reason it has not been dealt with in this report, but is for the future governance report.
In that case, then, I really, I think we should actually be saying that somewhere in the report, because it doesn't say that the role of ward members will be included in the governance report as such.
There's an interesting balance to what you're saying as well, because I think it's a relevant point that you make, but where one might be a ward member within a parish, council parish area, actually that ward member is precluded from the participation. So actually there's almost an unfair advantage in the opposite. I think there's a hole within the whole SIL principles here.
Well, I'm quite happy for it to be all ward members as opposed to ones in the unparished.
Yes, but all ward members. But what I'm actually saying is, but if there is a parish and if they have a neighbourhood plan, the ward member is actually barred from actually having a say in it. So there's a...
Well, Mr Chairman, I think that should be part of the governance review as well. I'm sorry, I think it should.
Okay, anyway, my concerns continue to mount with SIL. I think, are we in a position to draw this to a conclusion now, or are there... Right, so let's try and step through this. So, as per the papers, A is continue to develop administrative and, may we suggest, and governance arrangements for the SIL. Yes? B, I think, is engage with all interested parties, both internal council departments, parishes and members, council member, borough members, just being very specific there, and the public, where relevant prior to the agreed implementation, yes. C, I think, is kind of a given, but to ensure that infrastructure providers are aware, etc. Don't think we need to add anything to that. Councillor Wigadon? Right, so I'll move that from the chair. I'll take that as a second. Those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? One abstention noted, but the motion is carried. Such a few number of pages, there was plenty of substance to that. Thank you everyone for your attendance, and I'm happy to announce the meeting closed. With a 15-minute delay, Mr. Jarman.